In July 2008, 26-year-old Jenna Hewitt and a couple of friends went to Ditch Plains Beach, a popular tourist destination along the Montauk Peninsula. The beach was crowded that hot summer day, with scores of people looking to cool off by taking a dip in the ocean. As Jenna and her friends scouted around for a place to drop their belongings, they spotted a group of people all standing around staring at something in the sand. Curious, Jenna moved closer, squeezing her way through the crowd. The beachgoers were all staring at a dead animal that had washed up on shore. Under normal circumstances, this wouldn't be anything unusual. The bodies of dead animals did wash up on the beach occasionally. Anything from fish to birds to dead dogs, even the occasional whale. But this creature was unlike anything any of these people had ever seen before. Whatever this thing was, it was bloated and hairless. It looked like a bizarre combination of a reptile, a dog, a rodent, and a bird all rolled into one. It had tapering fingers, sort of like a raccoon, but it also had a very bird-like beak. Jenna snapped some photos of the creature that made their way online and quickly went viral. Animal experts were brought in to identify the creature, but they were all baffled. This thing, whatever it was, would come to be known as the Montauk Monster. This wasn't the last time something strange washed ashore either. Over the years that followed, a few other strange unidentified creatures would get brought in by the tide as well. Right away from the very beginning, many people had a strong suspicion about where all these mysterious dead animals were coming from. You see, about 20 miles away from the Montauk shores is a tiny island with a dark and terrifying reputation. This is Plum Island, a place where the official story goes that scientists studied rare animal diseases. But if the rumors about this place were true, there was a lot more going on than just that. Then in 2010, a security guard on Plum Island discovered the partially decomposed remains of another body that had washed up on the island shore. This body was even more disturbing than the others, though, because although news reports would describe this as the body of an unidentified man, some stories about these remains would also claim it wasn't entirely human either. In 2010, a security guard on Plum Island discovered a body on the island shores that, according to news reports, was strange. It was the body of a 6-foot-tall black male. The man was never identified, and most news reports you'll find only state that there were no signs of trauma. But those same news reports also say the man's fingers were abnormally long. A few of them even describe them as mutated. But perhaps the scariest detail about the body was that the skull reportedly had 5 symmetrical holes drilled into it, as if the man had gone through some sort of brain surgery. Officially, the Plum Island Research Facility only ever experimented on animals, not humans. And yet, stories like these about the mysterious body washing up on the island shores have helped spark conspiracy theories about what the scientists who worked on the island were actually doing. But how did this all start? During World War I, hundreds of thousands of soldiers were killed by deadly poison gas attacks. In order to prevent this from happening again, in 1925, the Geneva Protocol was signed, prohibiting the use of chemical and biological weapons in battle. After that, some countries, such as Japan and the United States, would attempt to skirt these rules by developing deadly bacteria and viruses as World War II ramped up. One country that was initially slow to catch up in this biological arms race was the United States. But by the time the war with Germany and Japan was over, a new threat was looming in the Soviet Union. During the Cold War, some members of the U.S. intelligence community began to fear that the Soviets were developing deadly biological weapons that could be used against the U.S. One of the departments that recognized the grave danger posed by such weapons was the Department of Agriculture. They knew there were some diseases which, if unleashed on U.S. soil, could devastate America's food supply. So in April 1948, Congress approved the development of an animal disease research center. It was ultimately decided that the safest place to build such a facility was Plum Island, a tiny stretch of land about 2 miles off the coast of Long Island. But not everyone was thrilled about this prospect. Many New Yorkers questioned the safety of having a lab where they experimented with deadly infectious diseases still so close to the mainland. These were diseases such as African swine fever and foot and mouth disease. FMD is highly contagious and it causes blister-like sores in the animal, as well as rapid weight loss and, eventually, death. Officials treated this disease with the utmost seriousness. An outbreak of FMD could wipe out much of the United States' livestock industry in a very short time. In 2001, an outbreak of FMD in the United Kingdom cost their livestock industry approximately $10 billion. after they were forced to slaughter more than 6 million cows. But the scientists in charge of creating the facility at Plum Island insisted that the place was safe. This was partially because the prevailing winds that blew through the area were directed toward the Atlantic Ocean. But keep in mind, just because winds are prevailing doesn't mean they don't sometimes change direction and blow the other way, towards people. When the government first started discussing how and where to build this research facility, they needed to turn to some of the world's leading disease experts, which is actually pretty problematic, because that also leads to one of the major conspiracy theories surrounding the island. According to Michael Carroll's book, Lab 257, when the U.S. decided they wanted to build a high-tech infectious disease laboratory, they turned to one of the world's foremost experts in deadly biological weapons. This was a former Nazi scientist named Erich Traub. During World War II, the Nazis had some of the most highly advanced weapons programs in the world. After the war was over, there was a mad scramble between the US and the Soviet Union to get their hands on all that research. So the two countries began snatching up all the Nazi scientists they could get their hands on and forcing them to work for them. Operation Paperclip was the name of the top-secret U.S. program where former Nazi scientists were brought to the U.S., given amnesty from the previous war crimes, and put to work. During World War II, Erich Traub was the chief scientist for Incel Reims, a secret Nazi biological warfare lab on a tiny island in the Baltic Sea. Traub reported directly to Adolf Hitler's second-in-command, Heinrich Himmler. Among other things Traub worked on for Himmler was developing a weaponized form of foot and mouth disease that could be sprayed on cattle and reindeer in Russia. One of the man's key breakthroughs was in developing the use of weaponized beetles and ticks in warfare. Ticks are tiny biting insects that feast on human blood. This also makes them really good at transmitting diseases through the blood as well. Diseases that could kill thousands of enemy soldiers without anyone ever having to fire a shot. Ironically, prior to the war breaking out, Erich Traub got part of his training into deadly diseases inside the United States. He spent a few years before the war studying rare animal diseases under a fellowship at the Rockefeller Institute in New Jersey. But the man was a Nazi sympathizer through and through. He attended rallies for the German-American Bund. Then after the war began, Traub returned to his homeland and began developing deadly bioweapons for Germany. After the war, Traub was captured by the Soviets and forced to work for them as part of Operation Ossivakim. But British intelligence managed to get him out, after which he was sent to the U.S. as part of Operation Paperclip. A few months after Traub arrived in America, he was sent to work at Fort Detrick, the Army's biological warfare headquarters in Frederick, Maryland. There, Traub described in great detail how he set up his first top-secret island laboratory on Incel Reims, which, according to Michael Carroll, was the basis for the animal disease labs on Plum Island. In 1952, Plum Island's director, Maurice Shahan, offered Traub a job on Plum Island. Officially, Traub never took the job, but Michael Carroll dug up records pointing to at least 3 separate occasions where Traub is known to have set foot on Plum Island, including during its dedication ceremony. One witness claimed that during the 1950s, a group of animal handlers were directed by a scientist to release ticks outdoors on the island. Although the witness didn't identify this person by name, he did refer to him as the Nazi scientist. Construction of the Plum Island facility went slow at first. Construction companies were forced to ferry in all their equipment and workers. Then, after the longshoremen went on strike, construction came to an abrupt stop. As time dragged on, the U.S. military began to question whether disease research was even necessary. The common belief was that if the Soviets were going to attack the U.S., they would use nuclear missiles, not biological weapons. In 1954, the Department of Defense withdrew their support for the program, after which the lab fell under the sole authority of the Department of Agriculture. Officially, this meant the facility would no longer study how to weaponize diseases. Instead, its focus would be on curing them. When the Plum Island Animal Research Center finally opened, its director, Dr. Maurice Shahan, put in place the strictest safety protocols to prevent any sort of deadly diseases from escaping. He refused to allow anyone to set foot on the island who didn't work there. Well, anyone except for former Nazi scientists, that is. Besides Erich Traub, though, Shahan did turn away all other potential visitors, including high-ranking military and government personnel. If you weren't one of the 400 lab employees with security clearance, you weren't allowed to set foot on Plum Island. Employees had to adhere to a series of safety protocols in order to work there. As soon as they got off the ferry, staff were made to remove all their street clothes and take a thorough shower. They also had to shower at least once more before leaving the island. Although some scientists who worked there reported being forced to shower as much as 8 or 10 times a day. Animals that were purposely dosed with one of the diseases they experimented with were routinely euthanized and sent down a chute into an incinerator. When workers left the island, they were under strict orders to avoid all contact with a number of different animal species, including cattle, poultry, rabbits, and pet birds. Dr. Maurice Shahan retired as Plum Island's director in 1963. He was then replaced by another scientist named Jerry Callis. Although the new director remained dedicated to the work being conducted on Plum Island, Callis also wasn't quite as strict with the safety procedures put in place by his predecessor. Callis placed a greater emphasis on public relations and upon boosting the research facility's image. He installed new roads and hired gardeners to tend the island's flower beds. He also began allowing more visitors to come to the island and check out the facilities. He even hosted company picnics for the families of his workers. In 1971, President Richard Nixon signed a ban on the United States developing biological weapons. Although officially this didn't affect the work being done at Plum Island because they weren't involved in weapons testing and development, at least not officially. Things continued going smoothly for Plum Island until 1978. That was when they had their first major outbreak. On the morning of September 15, 1978, a lab technician named Billy Dorosky rode the ferry to Plum Island as he did every morning. Except on that day, he was feeling miserable. The night before, he had gone out drinking, and now he was feeling very hungover. Billy's job involved injecting animals with viruses and drawing blood samples. On that day, Plum Island was scheduled to host a seminar on the bovine herpes mammalitis virus. Billy was supposed to administer doses of this virus to a group of cows in order for the scientists in attendance to observe them. Billy got off the ferry and trudged his way to lab number 257. His head was pounding and he felt nauseous. He began his day as he always did by showering and changing into coveralls. Then he went into the animal pens. Only he was shocked by what he saw. The cows were all sick. Thick foam dripped from the animals' mouths. They were all stumbling around unsteady on their feet, but this didn't make any sense because these cows hadn't received any injections yet, and should have been healthy. At first, Billy thought maybe he had stumbled into the wrong lab, so he double-checked the assignment on his clipboard, and he was indeed right where he was supposed to be. But if these cows were already sick, then this meant something had gone horribly wrong. Billy ran out of the room and called the lead scientist from the seminar and frantically explained what was going on. The scientist arrived minutes later and examined the cows. All their mouths were covered in blisters. He then phoned Jerry Callis, Plum Island's director. Callis told him to take some samples and analyze them. The results that came in a few hours later were staggering. That's because these cows weren't infected with the herpes virus they were scheduled to be injected with. They were sick with something much worse. These animals all had foot and mouth disease. Callis was forced to initiate the safety protocols put in place by his predecessor. This meant that every animal on the island would have to be slaughtered. On top of that, they had to ensure that every human being on the island was completely disease-free before being allowed to leave. Safety crews gathered up everyone's belongings, including their street clothes, jewelry, and wallets. Workers were given sterile white coveralls and tennis shoes to change into. People were allowed to keep only their eyeglasses and car keys, but only after these items were given a quick acid bath. By 8 p.m., most of the staff were allowed to leave the island. This left only a 35-man cleanup crew who still had a gruesome task ahead of them: to destroy every lab animal on the island. This included 94 cows, 87 pigs, 27 rabbits, 27 chickens, and 6 horses. The cleanup crew worked through the weekend, euthanizing these animals one by one, then incinerating their remains and all their hay and food as well. By Monday, the entire island was covered with a layer of ash so thick it made the place look like they'd been through a snowstorm. After that, Callis was forced to go to the press and admit that Plum Island just had experienced its first outbreak in history. The USDA didn't like this black eye to their reputation one bit, so they ordered Callis to stop referring to what was happening as an outbreak for fear of what could happen to U.S. meat exports. Any country with even a single incident of foot and mouth disease could immediately have all their meat exports banned. The results would be devastating to the U.S. meat industry. After that, Callis and his employees began referring to the outbreak as an incident. Call it an outbreak or call it an incident. The big problem Callis and all the other scientists faced was figuring out how the cows became sick in the first place. Or worse, could this disease have potentially gotten off the island? In 1981, the first vaccine for a strain of foot and mouth disease was developed. Callis hoped this would help alleviate some of the public's fears about safety on Plum Island. But Callis was still forced to retire just a few years later. He was then replaced by a professor from Washington State University named Roger Breeze. By that point in time, the federal government had already begun slashing Plum Island's budget. Breeze was ordered to cut costs wherever he could. This included firing staff and eliminating the island's landscaping budget. Breeze also began looking at privatizing much of the work being done on the island. This was something Callus had been strongly against during his time in charge. He feared that private companies would place corporate profits over public safety. And it appears he was right. But Breeze didn't appear to share these concerns. In 1991, he contracted with the Burns and Rose Services Corporation to run the facility. Burns and Rose quickly followed by laying off hundreds of staff members, bringing the number of workers on the island down to just 100. With so few employees left, this meant that cutting corners became a necessity. This quickly led to even more disastrous consequences. At around midnight on August 18, 1991, maintenance worker Philip Pagari made his regular ferry trip to Plum Island. On that night, the ferry rocked violently as large waves churned in the Atlantic. Weather forecasts were calling for a massive storm that might evolve into a hurricane. Before too long, those forecasts became official and Hurricane Bob was expected to reach Plum Island. Pagari monitored the air valves as hurricane-force winds and sheets of rain pelted the facility. By 9:30 a.m., wind speeds had reached up to 100 miles per hour. Many of the island's electrical poles were knocked over, sending the entire facility into a blackout. Plum Island had an underground backup power system for just such an emergency, but that system had shorted out a few months earlier, and to save money, the company in charge had decided not to fix it. This meant that with the island's main power grid offline and no backup electricity available, Pagari and his crew were forced to clean up in the dark. Typically, Pagari would have been heading home the following day, but the hurricane prevented the ferries from reaching the island. Pagari was stuck there dealing with a growing mess. Normally, animal waste was gathered into a 2-tank system. When the first tank filled up, the overflow would pour into the second tank. Your average cow excretes about 100 pounds of waste a day, and Lab 257 had dozens of cows, as well as pigs, chickens, rabbits, and all sorts of other animals. That was a lot of waste being created each day by a bunch of disease-infected animals. But with no power to the system, this meant the overflow tank couldn't open to receive any of the excess waste. As a result, raw sewage began to leak out onto the floors of the facility. Pagari and his crew gagged as they tried to hose away the raw sewage. But while this was going on, something even more disturbing occurred. That was when alarm bells began to go off as the temperature inside the island's freezers began to rise. This meant that soon many of the disease samples could become airborne. Pagari was horrified when he saw liquid dripping onto the floor from inside the freezer. He rushed to go find the emergency tanks of liquid nitrogen that he could hook up to the freezers to keep them cold. But the canisters were gone. They had been removed during the latest round of cost-cutting measures. The only thing Pagari and his crew could do was grab some mops and begin pushing the liquid from the freezers down into the wastewater drains. Pagari spent the next 24 hours trying to prevent further disaster. Eventually, the hurricane blew through the area, and Pagari and his men were allowed to return home. About a month later, the members of the maintenance crew received 2 letters. One of them was a letter of commendation for their hard work in saving the facility. The other letter was to inform them that they had all just been laid off. Shortly after, Pagari began to get sick. He developed unusual flu-like symptoms. But when he went to the hospital and underwent blood tests, no one could determine exactly what was wrong. Pagari reached out to his former employers at Plum Island, begging them to please analyze his blood, but they ignored him. Pagari's symptoms would persist for the next 6 years before they finally vanished just as quickly as they'd come on. Eventually, after 9/11, the federal government was reorganized and Plum Island was reclassified as a potential terrorist target. Control of the facility switched from the Department of Agriculture to the Department of Homeland Security. The DHS quickly reintroduced all the strict safety protocols that had been put in place when the facility first opened. Armed guards monitored the shoreline and prevented anyone from getting in or getting out. But just how strict were they? Because there are some people who believe that Plum Island is responsible for the release of at least one terrible contagion. Lyme disease is a debilitating illness that is diagnosed in more than 300,000 people each year. Sufferers can experience a wide range of symptoms, including joint pain, heart disease, and crippling paralysis. Some people can even develop a severe allergic reaction to consuming red meat known as alpha-gal. In 1975, people who lived in Lyme, Connecticut began to get sick with an unusual list of symptoms. Dozens of residents began suffering from extreme fatigue, headaches, facial paralysis, circular rashes, and joint pains. Some of the most extreme cases involved people having full-on psychotic breaks or becoming paralyzed. None of the doctors who examined these patients could identify this mysterious illness. The Connecticut Department of Health was alerted, and they were just as baffled. Several of the youngest patients were examined by doctors at nearby Yale University. They diagnosed these children with rheumatoid arthritis. an autoimmune disease that doesn't normally appear until well into late adulthood. By 1976, doctors had begun to pinpoint the source of this mysterious illness as being spread by bites from deer ticks. Some of these infected ticks were sent to Dr. Willy Bergdorfer, an expert on ticks and tick-borne illnesses from the National Institute of Health. Bergdorfer studied some of the insects from Lyme, Connecticut under a microscope and discovered an unusual bacteria called a spirochete. He had seen these tick-borne spirochetes before, but this one behaved unusually. This bacteria seemed particularly aggressive, attacking the skin, blood, and muscles. These spirochetes would be named Borrelia burgdorferi, after Dr. Bergdorfer, and the resulting disease they caused would eventually go on to be known as Lyme disease, after the town where it was first reported. When Lyme residents learned that their town was ground zero for a disease-causing insect infestation, many of the locals began to wonder where these infected bugs came from. Several townspeople began looking towards Plum Island, which sat just 11 miles away off the coast. But if this was true, then it also meant one of two things. Either these insects had been accidentally released on the mainland, or that the U.S. government had deliberately released them as part of an experiment. I know, it sounds crazy, but it wouldn't be the first time something like this has happened either. Back in 1950, the U.S. Navy sprayed bacterial spores over San Francisco in Operation Sea Spray. These spores were supposed to be harmless, but 11 people were sent to the hospital with urinary tract infections, and one of them may have even died as a result. In 1966, the Army tested how quickly bacteria could be spread through the New York City subway system by dropping light bulbs filled with another allegedly harmless bacteria on the tracks. Scientists estimated this bacteria spread to over 1 million New Yorkers. In 1962, the United States allegedly dropped infected ticks on sugarcane workers in Cuba as part of Operation Mongoose. In 1971, another mysterious virus decimated Cuba's pig population, threatening a major food source for the island nation. This would turn out to be the first and only outbreak of African swine fever in the Western Hemisphere. Although how the disease made its way to Cuba officially remains a mystery. The Cuban government was quick to point the finger of blame at the CIA. Considering the earlier attacks with weaponized ticks, this doesn't seem all that outlandish either. Reporters questioned former Plum Island director Jerry Callis about the possibility of a leak of infected ticks from the facility. He steadfastly denied that his scientists ever studied this particular bacteria associated with Lyme disease, although he did reluctantly admit that his scientists had studied tick-borne diseases such as swine fever. And do you know who else studied ticks for the U.S. government? Dr. Willy Bergdorfer, the man credited with discovering Lyme disease. It's been revealed that early in his career, Dr. Bergdorfer worked with the U.S. military to weaponize ticks. Much of the research he did involved seeing if ticks could be used as a bioweapon by infecting them with diseases that could be set loose on enemy forces. What's even worse, a lot of those ticks Dr. Bergdorfer worked with were released into the wild. Between 1966 to 1969, around 300,000 irradiated ticks were let loose to see how fast and how far they could spread. The ticks were irradiated as a way to track them. But once those ticks were out there, they were out there, and there was no getting them back. It also turns out that one of the varieties of ticks that were released also just so happens to be the most aggressive species of tick in existence, the Lone Star tick. This insect is so named because of the white star-shaped spot on their backs. These Lone Star ticks are unusual because unlike most other ticks, they actively hunt their prey. They can smell the ammonia and sweat and carbon dioxide from creatures breathing, and they use that to seek out and bite their prey. Unlike other species, these ticks can bite an animal multiple times. They do this in swarms, too. Lone Star ticks tend to cluster together by the thousands, and when a creature brushes up against one of these clusters, they can get bitten thousands of times. Oh, and they breed, too. A lot. A single female Lone Star tick can lay anywhere from 2,000 to 3,000 eggs at a time. Initially, these Lone Star ticks were thought to be confined to the southeastern United States, but since the late 1960s, those numbers have exploded, and now you can find Lone Star ticks across much of the continental U.S. Okay, but that still doesn't necessarily mean that the infected ticks originated on Plum Island. But if they did, there were certainly a lot of ways they could have gotten out. It turns out that some of the laboratory roofs had large holes in them for increased airflow, which could easily allow for insects to get in or out of the facility. On top of that, many of the facility's animals were kept in wide-open outdoor pens. Some witnesses said that birds and insects flew in and out of these pens all the time. Some people even saw wild deer popping into the pens to eat some of the animal feed. These same deer were known to sometimes swim to the mainland where they could have easily spread disease through infected ticks. The military actually began employing snipers to shoot deer they spotted crossing the ocean to the mainland. A 190-page USDA inspection report detailed all sorts of other unsafe conditions throughout the facility as well, including leaking roofs and walls, unsanitary safety practices, and buildings that were falling apart due to disrepair. Putting this all together on the surface, the idea that infected ticks could have escaped Plum Island certainly sounds plausible. At the same time, most mainstream scientists still tend to reject this theory that Lyme disease originated from Plum Island, or even that it first started in Lyme, Connecticut in 1975 at all. This is in part because it appears that reports of Lyme disease were occurring well before 1975. One story claims that a man from Spooner, Wisconsin was diagnosed with the disease back in 1969. There are even some reports of Lyme disease that go back further, a lot further. You may have heard of Otzi the Iceman, the frozen remains of an early human discovered in the Otstal Alps who lived sometime around 3300 BC. While scientists discovered his remains showed evidence of Lyme disease, which would mean the disease is actually thousands of years old. But what about the possibility that anything bigger than an insect may have escaped the island? In July 2008, the internet was abuzz with photos of a strange creature that washed up on Ditch Plains Beach in Long Island. This creature became known as the Montauk Monster, and it's certainly strange. The most common explanation you'll hear is that this is just the hairless and bloated corpse of a raccoon. Although when you look at the photos, the creature appears to have a dog's body, a raccoon's hands, and the beak of a bird. Some animal experts who have studied the photos say that this is nothing unusual and what we are mistaking for a beak is actually the normal skull structure for a raccoon, and that the creature's anatomy was simply bloated and distorted from time in the water. After news broke out about the mysterious creature, there were actually a number of curiosity seekers who went to the beach looking to see it for themselves. But by the next day, the creature's remains vanished. This, of course, led to even further speculation that some shadowy government agents must have scooped up the remains before anyone could study it further. In the summer of 2008, a young man came forward to give his own anonymous explanation for the Montauk Monster. He said he and some friends had been partying on the beaches of Shelter Island, New York, when they came across a dead raccoon in the sand. The group decided to give the critter a Viking funeral by placing its remains on an inflatable duck, which they pushed into the ocean and lit on fire. 2 weeks later, the Montauk Monster was found on Ditch Plains Beach. You have to admit that's a pretty weird explanation, though. It's also just weird enough that it might be true. In truth, there's just no actual evidence to prove without a shadow of a doubt that the Montauk Monster came from Plum Island. As for the unidentified human corpse found on Plum Island, the description I gave you here is pretty much all the information you can find on it. To this day, as far as I can tell, the body remains unidentified, and there is still no explanation why it looks so unusual or why it showed evidence of brain surgery. At the end of the day, all we have are a lot of conspiracy theories without a lot of solid evidence to back up what may or may not have occurred on Plum Island, and it may not matter anymore anyway. In 2023, the Plum Island Animal Disease Center was decommissioned. The work being done there is being moved to a new billion-dollar facility called the National Bio and Agro Defense Facility, which we should all hope is a lot safer than Plum Island. You see, because that new facility is in Manhattan, Kansas, right in the middle of America's heartland. So what do you think happened on Plum Island? Leave me a comment below and let me know your thoughts. Thanks again for checking out this video. If you want to see more creepy content like it, check out the video on the screen right now.